Hello, everybody. Welcome to part two of the week 3 video. If you haven't seen part 1, please go back and watch it. It has some important announcements about the class, and it's also a recap of last week's discussion. So please check that out. Okay, so in this part of the video, I'm going to just sort of provide a brief overview of Rousseau and the discourse on the inequality among men, right? How that actually came about. I don't want to tell you the entire story because I want you guys to read it for yourself because there's a lot of rich information in there. I've also got a PowerPoint that I'll be referencing from time to time. So if I'm looking to the side, that's just me making sure that I've covered all that I want to cover. So make sure you're checking out the PowerPoint as well because that contains good information. But I'll probably discuss some things that aren't in the PowerPoint as well. So you need to hit it all, right? The PowerPoint and the reading and the video. So somewhere in that amalgamation of stuff where we'll get to everything that I want to talk about. Okay, so just some background on Rousseau. Rousseau, he lived in the 18th century, right? So around the time of the American Revolution, Rousseau was alive, the French Revolution. It was the Age of Enlightenment, so science was a big deal, right? And this sort of notion that man could be perfected, the perfectibility of human nature, which is a really important part of Rousseau's philosophy that we'll talk about a little bit. It also, being the age of revolution, Rousseau was very controversial, right? A lot of his writings are very controversial, but a lot of the ideas that we have about society and what society should look like, and the notion, especially the notion of the social contract, pretty much come directly from Rousseau, right? So Rousseau is an intellectual giant, as they say, right? He wrote numerous books. He wrote the discourse on the arts and sciences. He wrote the discourse on the origins of inequality among men. He wrote the social contract, which is his most famous work. He wrote a book on sort of childhood education, how to educate children. It's called Emile. He wrote a romance. He wrote an autobiography, which was sort of like the modern, precursor of the autobiography. It's called his Confessions. So just an amazing guy. He was amazing intellectual, I should say. He wasn't a great guy. He was inducted into the sort of the French Hall of Fame, I guess you could say, right? He was buried as a hero in France, right? Even though he's not French technically, he was born in Geneva, in what is now Switzerland, but he lived a majority of his life in Paris, right? So that's why he sort of gets associated with the French. See if there's anything else I want to say about Rousseau. I think that's about it, right? As I said, there's some pretty stark differences between Rousseau's life and his writings. Right? He wasn't a great guy. He had a reputation for being a nasty guy, even though he writes about compassion and he writes about this, how you should educate a child. He had 5 children himself, and he left them all at sort of the doorsteps of an orphanage right after they were born. So, do as I say, not as I do, kind of thing, I suppose. Okay, so the discourses on the origins of inequality among men, right? Rousseau wrote this as part of a competition, right? The Dijon Academy, or the Academy of Dijon, think about the mustard, right? Put out this sort of competition, what are the causes of inequality among human beings, right? How have we ended up in the situation where, and this was, of course, the time in France where, there was a very wealthy aristocratic class and a very poor class, right? So how did we end up in this situation, right? And this is what prompted Rousseau to write the discourse on the origins of inequality among men. And he didn't win, right? But he thought that his work was good enough to publish anyway. He was right. The guy who won, nobody knows what he wrote because it no longer exists. But Rousseau's is quite famous, right? So essentially, I just want to give you guys a brief overview of what Rousseau says in the discourse, right? So obviously Rousseau has a very different account of man's natural state than Hobbes. And he lived about 100 years after Hobbes, so he was very familiar with Hobbes' work. And the chief difference, or the chief problem that Rousseau had with what Hobbes has done, and he said that Hobbes has taken man after man has already been civilized. Man has already lived in society. Hobbes' mentality has been formed through civilization, and he's trying to take that conception of man and place it back in man's natural state. And Rousseau says, no, that's very different. You've already, man's psychology has already changed significantly over the thousands of years where man. So evolution was a big thing for Rousseau, right? We'll talk about that. Perfectibility, he calls it, right? Is a very powerful force that has changed human nature essentially from when man was in man's natural state to man in civilization. And you can't make that mistake of taking what we understand as human nature now in civilization and trying to place that back into man's natural state, right? So that was the main problem that Rousseau had with Hobbes's characterization of the state of nature. It wasn't an accurate depiction of the state of nature according to Rousseau. This also brings up the distinction in the types of things that Hobbes and Rousseau were doing, right? Because remember, Hobbes was doing a thought experiment, right, where he wanted to say, okay, here's a way that we can legitimately prove that government is necessary, right? And we hear this all the time today with libertarians and things like that. Government's not necessary. Taxes are theft, essentially, right? And Hobbes saying, no, these things are necessary. Otherwise, we end up in the world that's portrayed in The Road, where you have people cannibalizing each other and those kinds of things, right? So Hobbes says government, yes, bad, necessary evil, right? Much, much better than the state of nature. Rousseau is giving sort of an anthropological account of the way that human beings evolved, or humanity has changed over time. So when Rousseau is talking about man in the state of nature, natural man, he's talking about a very primitive form of human being, right? He's talking, you can even think about, before human beings started living together, before human beings developed language, just one step away from, monkey, essentially, right? So when Rousseau is talking about natural man, that's what Rousseau is talking about in the beginning, right? And he says this is where Hobbes is wrong, because there's no comparison between man in civilization and man pre-civilization, right? And he says that he's man in his natural state is the most general creature you can imagine. It's between sort of like the brutes of being purely animal, right, and sort of the excesses and the terrible things that Rousseau believes exist in human civilization. So it's a happy medium. But the thing about human beings and humanity is, and the things that makes man or humanity distinctive from other animals like apes, cats, whatever, right, is something that Rousseau calls perfectibility. And he doesn't mean this necessarily, at least in this case, he doesn't mean it in the sense that we can become perfect. He means that we can evolve, right, and we change over time in the way, and we learn. That's what he's talking about, right? So you think about the notion of progressive, right? And we hear that term thrown around a lot in today's political discourse. Progressive, progressive versus conservative, you could say, right? And Rousseau was very much progressive. He thought that man was progressive. Man learned by imitating what others did, and that's how we ended up where we ended up, right? So he talks about it, and you guys will read this in the discourse, right? He just sort of walks us through these different stages, where man starts out solitary, out there hunting by themselves, right? And this is where he gets to sort of this concept, and this is where this notion of self-interest becomes really important in Rousseau's work. He has two different concepts of self-interest. The first is he calls amour de soi, which is self-love, right? But when he says amour de soi, he means self-preservation. We're going to do the things that keep us safe, that feed us, that nurture us, things like that. The other type of self-love, and this is the one that Rousseau thinks is bad, and I'll get to this in a second, is something he calls amour propre. And amour propre is more like vanity, right? And comparing what I've got to what you've got, right? And then trying to make myself better than you. That's not what the original sort of self-preservation. The original self-preservation was just doing the things necessary to survive. Me getting ahead of you is where Rousseau thinks that we get into trouble, right? And that's why he has this quote about property. I'm going to read it to you. If I can find it. Let's see. Here we go. The first man who enclosed a piece of ground and said, "This is mine," is the true founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not any one have saved mankind, by pulling up the stakes, right, around the property, or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, beware of listening to this impostor, right? You're undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth to nobody, right? So this notion of me getting property and, taking it away from you is where Rousseau thinks that we've gone astray, right? So let's see. Okay, I'm just going to go through my slides real quick here. Right, so man starts off solitary, right? But eventually, through time, just by trying to survive, we occasionally run into others, right? And that's where this notion of perfectibility comes in, because we run into somebody else and we see, oh, they're using a rock to hunt. I was using a tree. The rock seems better. We learn that way, right? And Rousseau says this is also where rationality starts to pop up, right? Because in interacting with other, we notice there's a relationship between two things, where before we were just thinking about ourselves, then we realize there are relationships, right? And those relationships and the way that things relate to one another make us rational and actually think things through, right? And Rousseau says eventually this, the development of rationality in our brains is what allows us to be superior over other animals. Eventually, over time, we keep going down this way, and we reach a point where we realize, oh, it's actually in our interest if we band together and hunt, right? And we're not doing this because we want to form community. We're doing it because we think we can be more efficient. And perhaps this goes back to sort of the notion of the marauders as well, right, in the road. But we eventually start doing that, and over time, we develop, we become more efficient at hunting. We gather more to ourselves. We start to build houses, right? And eventually we get to the point where we start living together in small communities. And, when we're first living in the small communities, so we're still in this place of amour de soi where we're self-interested. But then Rousseau says there's another component of human nature he calls pity, right? Which is essentially compassion for others. He says naturally man doesn't like to see the suffering of others. We have compassion for other people, right? And he says this is especially known in families, right? So going back to the things we were talking about in the road, he says there's nothing more, there are no more finer feelings in human nature than conjugal love of your spouse, and parental affection, care for your children, right? So he thinks those are the highest. And then he says, we eventually become more and more sophisticated. We start to divide labor up, where we realize that certain people are better and we can be more efficient if we divide things up, right? That leads to leisure time. More communities, more families start to come together. And eventually, over time, as people have more leisure time, right, so more time to sit around and think and do art and sing and music and all these sorts of things that Hobbes says are not possible in the state of nature. As people come together and have the leisure to do that, as they start living closer together, that's when we lead into this point of amour propre, right, where people become vain because they start comparing themselves to other people, right? They say, oh, well, this guy's a good dancer, but I'm a better dancer, right? Or this guy can sing well, but I can sing better, So it's this combination of leisure time and the co-location of people together, right? So you put this notion of leisure time together along with people living in close proximity to each other, then you have this sort of notion of competition that comes up, and particularly Rousseau says the competition comes up for sexuality, right? For choosing sexual partners, right? So we want to be the best singer so we can attract the best mate, right? We can have to have the best life, things like that. And Rousseau thinks essentially it's all downhill from there, right? So we develop sort of this notion of vanity, trying to compete against one another. And eventually over time, as we become more sophisticated, Rousseau says that the two major technological advancements that lead to the downfall of humanity are agriculture, where we can grow things and we can store them, right? Because that's where property starts to come in, because we are actually growing more than we can consume. So in addition to feeding myself, I now have, 100 bottles of tomatoes or whatever, right? And then the notion of property sort of comes out of that. And he says the other one is metallurgy, right? How to fashion tools. He says iron, making iron essentially, because that once again, that leads to us becoming more efficient and having more than we actually need, right? And he thinks essentially from there, the notion of property becomes a part of things. And as sort of Rousseau says, once you've got this notion of property, there's no going back, right? And he says that's the main downfall that Hobbes makes, is that he takes people that are in civilization back to the state of nature, and they already have that sense of property developed in them, which man in his natural state or her natural state doesn't have that sense of property, right? So that's sort of the major difference. Okay, so this week we're going to watch the movie Avatar, right? To see, do we think that, are the people who are living, people that are living on, I think Pandora, I think it's called, if they're the people that are living on Pandora, if they're actually good representations of Rousseau's sort of notion of, the natural state of humanity, and if so, why and how? If you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Hope you have a good week.